Eliza Holt hit the ground before she even heard herself scream. The summer storm came down on that Virginia road like God himself had something to prove, and Eliza muddy, bleeding from both palms. Her good dress, torn at the hem, pressed her hands into the red earth and made herself a promise. She would not cry. She had not cried since the morning her mother died, and she was not about to start now, not for Arabella, not for this errand, not for herself. She just had to get back before dark. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and follow Eliza's story all the way to the end. Drop a comment below with the city you're watching from. I love seeing how far this story travels. Eliza Holt had made mistakes in her 22 years, but she was beginning to think that agreeing to ride out to the Harmon farm alone in July in Virginia, with storm clouds stacking themselves on the horizon, like someone was building a wall straight to heaven, might have been the worst one yet. She hadn't had a choice. That was the honest truth of it. Arabella had stood in the parlor of Crane House that morning, with her chin tilted up and her eyes doing that thing. They did narrow and cold and certain, and she had said, "You'll go to the Harmon farm and collect the linen order before supper, Eliza. That's not a request." And Aunt Margarite had been right there beside her arranging flowers. She didn't care about not looking up. Never looking up. So Eliza had gone. She'd been on her way back when the horse spooked a crack of thunder so sharp it split the air in two, and she'd hit the road hard, rolled twice and come to rest with her palms bleeding and her whole left side on fire with a deep, dull ache she didn't want to think about. The horse was gone. The package was gone. The storm was here. She pushed herself to her feet, and that was when she heard the sound of hooves, not running away from her, coming toward her. She barely had time to step aside before a massive black horse pulled up short, rearing just enough to remind her that the animal outweighed her by 1,000 pounds and had opinions about the rain. The man on its back brought it down with a single word. Easy. Just that. One word. And the horse listened. Eliza looked up. He was big. That was the first thing she registered. Broad through the shoulders, in a way that said he hadn't gotten there by accident. Dark hair plastered to his forehead from the rain jaw, set hard eyes the color of good Virginia soil, brown and dark and steady. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a problem he hasn't decided how to solve yet. "You're bleeding," he said. "I noticed," Eliza said. His eyes moved to her hands, then back to her face. Something shifted in them. Not pity. She would have hated pity. "Where's your horse?" "Gone." "Gone where?" "That direction." She pointed down the road. Rapidly. He didn't smile, but something in his jaw loosened just a fraction. "You live near here?" "Crane House, about 3 miles east." "You're Marguerite Crane's niece." It wasn't a question. Eliza felt the familiar little twist in her chest that came every time someone said it that way. Not curious, not warm. Just placing her, categorizing her. Crane's niece. The poor one. The one who didn't really belong. "I am," she said, keeping her voice even. He studied her for a moment. Then he swung down from the horse in one clean motion and stood in front of her, and she had to stop herself from stepping back because he was taller than she'd realized, and this close she could see the quality of his coat, the cut of his boots. This was not a man who worried about where his next meal was coming from. "Ambrose Whitfield," he said. Her stomach dropped. Ambrose Whitfield. The Whitfield of Whitfield Manor. The man who owned approximately 1/3 of the county and had a reputation for being colder than a January river and twice as unforgiving. She'd never seen him up close. She'd never wanted to. "I know who you are," she said. "Do you?" He reached into his saddlebag and produced a cloth clean, folded the kind of cloth that cost more than most people's Sunday shirts, and held it out to her. "Your hands." She looked at the cloth. She looked at him. "Take it," he said. Not harsh, just certain. She took it. She pressed it against her palms, and the sting made her breath catch, but she didn't make a sound. She'd learned early that sounds drew attention, and attention from Arabella was never the kind you wanted. You shouldn't be out here alone, Ambrose said. I'm aware of that. Then why are you? Eliza looked up at him. The rain was coming harder now, drumming on the road, running off the brim of his hat in small rivers. She must have looked like something the creek had spit out. She could feel it. I had an errand, she said. For your aunt. For my cousin. His eyes did something complicated. Come on then. I beg your pardon. Whitfield Manor is a quarter-mile up this road. You're bleeding, your horse is somewhere in the next county by now, and this storm isn't going anywhere. He took the reins of his horse and looked at her with a patience that was somehow more unsettling than impatience. I'm not going to leave you standing in the road. Mr. Whitfield, I don't? You don't what? He wasn't being cruel. He was asking a genuine question, like he truly could not imagine what objection she might have. You don't want to get out of the rain. You don't want your hands tended to properly. You don't want your aunt to know you're safe. Eliza closed her mouth. He held out his hand. She stared at it, large and steady even in the rain. A man accustomed to offering a hand and having it taken without question. A man who had never in his life stood in a parlor and been invisible while the people around him arranged flowers and discussed whether the silver needed polishing. She took his hand. His grip was firm and brief. He helped her up onto the horse, and then they were moving through the rain, and Eliza kept her hands barely at his waist, trying to take up as little space as possible, and told herself that this was fine. This was just practical. This was just getting out of the storm. Whitfield Manor was everything Crane House pretended to be. That was Eliza's first thought when they came through the gates. She'd heard about it, of course. Everyone in the county had heard about Whitfield Manor. But hearing and seeing were different animals entirely. A housekeeper met them at the door, Mrs. Hawkins, a compact woman with sharp eyes, and a manner that said she had been running this household since before Eliza was born, and intended to keep doing so until she was good and ready to stop. Mr. Whitfield. Then her eyes moved to Eliza, taking in the state of her with a single efficient sweep. I'll have the blue parlor warmed and a tray sent up. And water for her hands, Ambrose said. And dry clothes if you can find something suitable. Of course. Mrs. Hawkins was already moving. Eliza stood in the entrance hall, dripping onto polished floors, and felt acutely aware of every tear in her dress, every streak of mud on her face, every way in which she did not belong in this house. You don't have to, she started. Sit down before you fall down, Ambrose said, and disappeared through a doorway. She didn't fall down. She did sit down because her left side was starting to make its feelings known in a way she couldn't ignore, and because the chair she'd been pointed toward was the kind of chair you could feel the quality of through your skirts. Mrs. Hawkins reappeared with warm water and clean linen and tended to Eliza's hands with the brisk efficiency of someone who had seen worse and would see worse again, and had no patience for drama about it. Eliza appreciated that more than she could say. You're Margarite Crane's niece, Mrs. Hawkins said, wrapping Eliza's right hand. Yes, ma'am. Your mother was Charlotte Holt. Eliza looked up. She was. Something moved across Mrs. Hawkins' face. Not pity. Something older than that. I knew your mother. Good woman. Eliza swallowed hard. Yes, ma'am, she was. That was all. Mrs. Hawkins tied off the bandage, stood up and said, The dress I found is a bit large, but it'll do. Warmer than what you've got on anyway. There's tea on the table. And then she was gone too. Eliza sat in the quiet of the blue parlor, which was, she noted, 3 times the size of what Arabella called the parlor at Crane House, and drank tea that was better than anything she'd had in 4 years, and tried to stop her hands from shaking. They'd been shaking since she hit the ground. She hadn't let herself notice until now. How bad is your side? She startled. Ambrose was standing in the doorway, changed out of his wet coat, a glass in his hand. He was watching her the same way he'd watched her on the road, like a problem, like something that needed to be solved carefully. It's fine, she said. You've been holding it since you sat down. She made herself move her hand. I said, "It's fine, Mr. Whitfield." He came into the room and sat down across from her, and she noticed that he sat the way he did, everything deliberately, like every movement was chosen. He looked at her over his glass. "Who sent you out in this weather? The storm came up fast. Who sent you out alone to the Harmon farm?" Eliza met his eyes. "My cousin, as I said." "Arabella?" "Yes." "For linen." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She could see him doing the arithmetic, the quality of her dress against the wealth of the house she came from, the fact that she'd been sent out alone on a summer afternoon with no escort, the fact that the errand had been for linen, and she hated it. She hated being read. She hated being understood by strangers in parlors she didn't belong in. "It wasn't dangerous," she said. "Not normally. The storm isn't the point." His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "I know what the point is," Eliza said quietly. "Do you, Mr. Whitfield?" She set down her teacup. She needed her hands to be still for this, and they nearly were. "I appreciate what you've done, truly. But my situation at Crane House is not your concern, and I would be grateful if you would simply send word so they know you're safe." "Yes. I've already done that." She blinked. "I sent a rider out when we arrived." He looked at her steadily. "Your aunt knows you're here. She'll know you'll be returned home once the storm passes, or first thing in the morning if it doesn't." Something moved through Eliza that she didn't have a name for right then. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was something older and sadder, the feeling you got when someone did something thoughtful before you'd even asked, because they'd looked at your situation and simply seen it. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet." There was something dry in his voice, not quite humor. "Your aunt's reply suggested she's considerably more concerned about the linen than about you." The silence stretched out between them. Eliza looked at her tea. "The package was lost," she said. "When I fell." "I know." "Arabella will—" She stopped herself. "She'll what?" Eliza looked up. His eyes were steady on her, and there was something in them now, not just assessment. Something sharper, something that wanted an honest answer. "She'll be angry," Eliza said simply. "And when Arabella is angry, what happens then?" "That's not your concern, Mr. Whitfield." "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, glass turning slowly in his hands. He was close enough now that she could see the small scar above his left eyebrow, the careful set of his mouth. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was working out how to say it. "Miss Holt." His voice had changed. Quieter, more deliberate. "You are sitting in my house with bandaged hands and a bruised side, and you are more worried about a lost package of linen than about your own condition. That tells me something. It tells you I understand priorities. It tells me," he said, "that you've been treated like an afterthought for so long, you've started to believe that's all you are." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Eliza didn't breathe. She'd had 4 years of it. 4 years since her mother died, and Aunt Marguerite had taken her in with the particular generosity of a woman who wanted you to feel every ounce of what that generosity cost her. 4 years of knowing exactly where she stood. 4 years of making herself small enough not to be a burden and failing at it anyway, because Arabella could always find a new way to remind her. She had never said any of that out loud. Not once. Not to anyone. She was not about to say it to Ambrose Whitfield. "You don't know me," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "No," he agreed. "I don't." He stood up, set down his glass, and looked at her for a moment with that same unsettling directness. "But I knew your mother," he said. "She used to ride past the east fence of this property every Sunday morning. She had a gray horse, and she always sat up straight." He paused. "She deserved better than what she got, too." He walked out of the room. Eliza sat very still for a long time after he left. Outside, the storm was picking up again. She could hear it against the windows, the rain driving in sheets, the thunder rolling long and low across the Virginia hills. She was not going home tonight. She had known it even before he said it. The storm had decided things for her the moment she hit that road. She should have been afraid. She should have been worried about what Arabella would say, what Aunt Marguerite would conclude, what the county would gossip about when word got out that Marguerite Crane's niece had spent a night at Whitfield Manor. Instead, she sat in a chair that cost more than her bed with her hands wrapped in his linen, and her mother's name still warm in the air. And she thought about a woman she hadn't let herself think about in a long time, sitting straight on a gray horse, passing a fence on a Sunday morning, and something cracked open in her chest that she hadn't meant to let crack. She didn't cry. She almost did. She pressed her bandaged hands together in her lap and breathed through it until it passed. Chug, Mrs. Hawkins showed her to a guest room that was quieter than anything in Crane House had ever been. A bed that felt like a reprieve. A small lamp burning low on the table. She lay on top of the quilt, not ready to be a guest, not willing to take more than she had to, and stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of the day. Ambrose Whitfield had not been what she'd expected. She wasn't entirely sure what she had expected. Cold, people said. Unapproachable. He'd bought out 2 neighboring farms in the last year and expanded his holdings west toward the river. And there were men in the county who talked about him the way men talked about weather. Not with personal feeling, just with the awareness that he was a force that didn't ask your permission. He hadn't been cold tonight. He had been direct, honest, in a way that didn't come wrapped in cruelty. He'd looked at her situation and named it plainly. And the thing about being named plainly, even when it stings, was that it was different from being invisible. She didn't know what to do with that. She heard footsteps in the hall. A pause, then a knock, quiet and deliberate. "Miss Holt?" His voice through the door. "Yes?" Her own voice came out steadier than she felt. "Mrs. Hawkins says you haven't eaten anything." "I wasn't hungry." A pause. "She'll be offended." Despite herself, despite everything, Eliza almost smiled. "Tell her I'll eat something in the morning." Another pause, longer this time. "Miss Holt." His voice was different now, careful, like a man placing his footing on uncertain ground. "The linen. I can have it replaced before you go home tomorrow. Same order, same delivery. Your cousin doesn't need to know it was lost." She went very still. "Why would you do that?" she asked. A long pause. "Because it costs me nothing," he said, "and it might save you something." She didn't have an answer. She didn't have anything for a moment. "Good night, Miss Holt," Ambrose said quietly. His footsteps moved away down the hall. Eliza sat in the dark with her hands pressed flat against the quilt and her heart doing something she hadn't told it to do, and thought, this man is dangerous. Not in the way people meant when they said it about him, not dangerous like land disputes and cold negotiations. Dangerous like something you hadn't known you were missing until you were standing right next to it. She lay back down. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a very long time. Morning came gray and warm, the storm done and gone, the world washed clean. The way Virginia summers always recovered, like it had never happened, except for the branches down in the yard and the mud still thick on every road. Eliza was up before the house. Old habit. At Crane House, if you weren't up first, you spent the day catching up. She had found the kitchen by instinct, following the smell of coffee like a rope through the quiet, and she had been standing at the window with a cup she'd poured herself when she heard him come in. "You're up early," Ambrose said. "So are you." He came to stand near the fire, not close to her, and poured his own coffee. He looked like a man who had not slept particularly well, and like a man who would never in 1,000 years admit it. "Road should be passable by mid-morning," he said. "I can walk." You won't. It wasn't harsh. It was just final. Eliza looked at him sideways. You do that a lot. Do what? Say things like they're already decided. He glanced at her. They usually are. Not always. She turned to face him, and something about the early morning, the quiet, the coffee, the way the light came soft through that window, made her braver than she might have been otherwise. Mr. Whitfield, about last night, the offer you made about the linen. It stands. I don't want you to do that. He looked at her. Why not? Because then I owe you something. You don't. I would feel as though I did. And that's... She stopped, started again. I have spent 4 years owing things to people who keep a very careful accounting. I would rather walk home and face Arabella than add another debt to my name. He was quiet for a moment. That's not why I offered, he said. I know that. I believe that. She looked at him steadily. But I'm telling you how it would feel on my side of it. And I think you're the kind of man who wants to know that. Something moved across his face. Something she couldn't read. You are, he said slowly. Not what I expected, Miss Holt. What did you expect? Honestly. He set down his cup. Someone more frightened. I'm frightened all the time, Eliza said. I've just been doing it long enough to do it quietly. The silence between them was different this time. Not weighted, not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had just told each other something true and were sitting with the novelty of it. Ambrose looked at her for a long moment, and then he heard it before she did hoofbeats on the road coming fast. Not a messenger's single horse. Too many horses for that. Too much noise for a simple errand. She knew before she saw them, the way you sometimes know things before they arrive. The way you know a storm before it hits. The way you know deep down that the quiet never lasts. Mrs. Hawkins appeared in the kitchen doorway, and her face said everything before her words did. Mr. Whitfield, Miss Holt. She paused for just a breath. Miss Arabella Crane is at the gate, with her mother, and they appear to have brought company. Eliza set her coffee cup down on the table. Her hand, she noticed, was perfectly steady. Eliza had imagined this moment before. Not this exact moment, not Whitfield Manor, not the kitchen, not the coffee still warm in her hand, but the shape of it. The shape of Arabella arriving somewhere Eliza was and making sure everyone in the room understood exactly what that meant. She had imagined it, and she had never once in 4 years figured out how to be ready for it. How many? Ambrose asked Mrs. Hawkins. His voice hadn't changed. That steadiness again, the kind that wasn't pretending. 4 horses. Miss Arabella, Mrs. Crane, and 2 gentlemen. I don't know the gentleman. Ambrose set down his cup. He looked at Eliza, and his eyes did that thing, that quick, direct read of her face, and he said quietly, You don't have to go to that door. Yes, I do, Eliza said. No, you don't. Mr. Whitfield. She met his gaze. If I don't go to that door, it will be worse later. That's how it works. Something passed through his expression. Not argument. Just the recognition of a thing he didn't like, but understood. Then I'll go with you, he said. She almost told him not to. Almost said again that it wasn't his concern. But the truth was standing right there between them. She'd said it herself, not an hour ago. She was frightened all the time. She just did it quietly. And this particular morning, with her hands still wrapped and her side still aching and the sound of those hooves still in her ears, she was very, very tired of doing it alone. All right, she said. They walked out together. Arabella Crane had the kind of beauty that people noticed first and forgot to look past. Pale and dark-haired and perfectly arranged, even at this hour, even after what had to have been a hard ride on wet roads. She was 24 and had known since she was 12 that the world owed her things, and she collected on that debt daily. She was already off her horse when Eliza and Ambrose came through the front door, and the moment she saw them together close, Eliza's hands bandaged, wearing a dress that didn't belong to her, Something moved across Arabella's face that she was just barely too well-bred to let become a full expression. "Cousin." Her voice was smooth, warm even, pitched exactly right for an audience. "Thank God. We've been worried sick." "Have you?" Eliza said. Arabella's eyes moved to Ambrose, then back to Eliza. A calculation so fast you could almost miss it. "Mr. Whitfield." Arabella extended her hand with the practiced grace of a woman who had been taught exactly how to extend her hand and had been practicing ever since. "How very kind of you to shelter my cousin. We are in your debt." "No debt," Ambrose said. He didn't take her hand with any particular warmth. He took it briefly correctly and let it go. "Your cousin was injured on the road. The storm made returning last night impossible." Of course. Aunt Marguerite had come forward now, a taller, colder version of Arabella, the original, from which the copy had been made. She had the same pale face and the same careful eyes, and 20 more years of practice hiding what she really thought. "We were just so concerned. Weren't we, Arabella?" "Terribly," Arabella agreed. Eliza stood very still and said nothing because there was nothing to say to this. She had learned that early. When Arabella performed concern, the worst thing you could do was argue with the performance. You'd lose. Arabella was better at this than she was. Arabella had always been better at this. "Well," Aunt Marguerite said with the particular tone she used when she was finished with pleasantries and wanted everyone to know it. "Eliza, go and get your things. We'll ride back together." "She can have breakfast first," Ambrose said. The words landed flat and clean, and Aunt Marguerite's expression did something complicated. She was not accustomed to being contradicted, not in her own home, and certainly not in someone else's. "I appreciate that, Mr. Whitfield, but—" "She hasn't eaten," he said. "She fell from a horse yesterday and hasn't eaten since. She'll have breakfast before she goes anywhere." The silence was sharp enough to cut. Arabella looked at Eliza. Her eyes said, "You will pay for this." Eliza looked back. She kept her face still. "How generous," Arabella said, turning back to Ambrose with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "In that case, perhaps we might all come in." "Of course," Ambrose said. And something in the way he said it told Eliza that he had expected this and had decided he didn't mind. "Mrs. Hawkins will see to breakfast." He touched Eliza's arm as they turned back toward the house. The briefest thing, just the tips of his fingers against her elbow, and it was so quiet and deliberate that she almost missed it. But she didn't miss it. It was the kind of touch that said, "I see what's happening. I'm not leaving." She breathed. She walked. The two gentlemen had come in behind Arabella and Aunt Marguerite, and Eliza heard them introduced over her own heartbeat. Mr. Hartwell, a man in his late 30s, with the comfortable look of someone who had always had just enough money to be certain of himself, and Mr. Price, younger, sharper-eyed, who looked at Whitfield Manor the way certain men look at things they want to own. She noted that both of them looked at Arabella first, and Eliza not at all, which was all things considered a mercy. They sat down to breakfast. Mrs. Hawkins produced eggs and bread and coffee, with the air of someone who had been managing unexpected guests her entire adult life, and harbored no opinion about it. Eliza ate. She ate deliberately because Ambrose had said she would, and because she was in fact hungry, and because there was something small and fierce in her that refused to let Arabella's eyes tracking her from across the table take away the first decent meal she'd had in weeks. "Mr. Whitfield," Arabella said, with the voice she used when she wanted something. "I understand you've been expanding your holdings toward the river." "I have. My mother has always admired the east meadow of this property. She says the views are extraordinary." "She's welcome to ride out and see them," Arabella smiled. "Perhaps when the road's dry." She tilted her head just slightly, the way she did when she was sharpening something. "You must find it terribly lonely rattling about in this house by yourself." The table went very quiet. Eliza put down her fork. "I manage," Ambrose said. His voice was pleasant and gave nothing away. "A man of your station ought to have a proper household." Arabella's gaze moved to Eliza for just a second, deliberate, pointed, and then back to Ambrose. A wife. Company. Arabella, Aunt Marguerite said with a tone that meant she was not actually stopping Arabella, just providing the appearance of stopping her. I'm only saying what everyone thinks, Arabella said lightly. Mr. Hartwell laughed. Mr. Price smiled at his coffee. Eliza looked at the window and thought about how far it was to the road, and whether her side could handle 3 miles on foot, and decided it probably could. Miss Crane. Ambrose's voice. Arabella looked at him. Your cousin fell from a horse in a storm because she was sent out alone to fetch linen. His voice was still pleasant. Every word was placed like a stone. I imagine your household manages fine. The silence was different this time. Tighter. Arabella's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes did. Eliza is very capable, she said sweetly. Yes, Ambrose said. She is. He looked at Eliza then, not performing it for the table, just looking at her. And the look said something she didn't have words for yet, something she wasn't sure she was ready for, but it said it plainly, the way he did everything. Eliza picked up her fork again and finished her breakfast. She was not going to let it be wasted. The morning moved toward its inevitable end. Arabella talked. Mr. Hartwell talked more. Mr. Price watched Whitfield Manor with those acquisitive eyes and asked polite questions about acreage and water rights that weren't really polite at all. Aunt Marguerite accepted a second cup of coffee and said almost nothing, which Eliza had learned over 4 years meant she was thinking harder than usual. When the table was finally cleared and Arabella rose with the air of a woman who had accomplished what she'd come for, even though as far as Eliza could tell, she hadn't accomplished anything at all, Mrs. Hawkins appeared with Eliza's cleaned and pressed original dress folded and wrapped in paper. Your things, Miss Holt. Thank you, Mrs. Hawkins. The housekeeper held her gaze for a moment longer than strictly necessary. You're welcome here any time, she said, and walked away before anyone could make anything of it. Eliza stood in the entrance hall, with her bundle and her bandaged hands, and waited for the inevitable moment when she would follow Arabella out to the horses and climb up behind someone and ride back to Crane House, and things would proceed exactly as they always proceeded. She knew this shape too. She had lived inside it for 4 years. Eliza. Arabella's voice at her shoulder, low and warm, and not warm at all. A word. They stepped aside. Just far enough. Arabella positioned herself so her back was to the room, and her face was only visible to Eliza, and her expression changed the way a house changes when company leaves immediate complete. What do you think you're doing? She said quietly. I beg your pardon. Don't. The sweetness was gone entirely. Don't play simple with me. You spend a night in Ambrose Whitfield's house, and you walk out to meet me side by side with him like... She stopped herself, recalibrated. Do you know what people will say? People will say I was caught in a storm and given shelter, Eliza said. Because that's what happened. People will say whatever I tell them happened. Arabella's voice was very quiet and very certain. You know that. Eliza did know that. That was the truth of it, plain and ugly. The linen, Arabella said, shifting, was not recovered. It was lost when I fell. Then you'll need to replace it. I don't have money to... That's not my concern. Arabella straightened. You'll figure it out. You always do. The sweetness came back like a coat she put on. Ready? The road should be clear. She walked back toward the door. Eliza stood for a moment. Just a moment. She thought about 4 years. The small bedroom at the end of the hall. The meals where she sat last and ate least. The errands. The linen. The horse that spooked in a storm, and her palms hitting the road, and nobody sending a search party until Arabella could make an entrance out of it. She thought about her mother on a gray horse sitting straight, and a man who had noticed. Miss Holt! Ambrose was beside her. She hadn't heard him cross the room, and she should have because he was not a quiet man, but she'd been somewhere else in her head, and now he was there, and his voice was low and meant for only her. You're not replacing that linen, he said. Mr. Whitfield? I'm not offering. I'm telling you. His jaw was set. I sent the order yesterday evening before you went to bed. It arrived at Crane House this morning. Same order, same quantity. He paused. As far as your cousin knows, it was never lost. Eliza stared at him. You went ahead, she said. Even after I told you. You told me how it would feel, he said. I heard you. And then I thought about what it would feel like if I did nothing. And you went home, and she took it out of you. His voice was level. I thought about that, and I decided I didn't care how it looked on my ledger. The thing that had cracked open in her chest the night before cracked a little further. She was angry. She needed to be angry because the alternative. The other thing sitting right underneath the anger was something she could not afford in this entrance hall with Arabella 10 feet away. You had no right, she said. No, he agreed. I didn't. It wasn't your place. It wasn't. He didn't flinch. But here's what I know about right and place and all of that, Miss Holt. None of it matters much when you're the one in the mud. Eliza looked at him. Her hands had started that tremble again. She pressed them together at her waist bandages against bandages and breathed through it. Eliza. Arabella's voice from the door. A name and a command, the way she always said it. Eliza turned, and then she turned back. The next time you do something for me without asking, she said quietly, I'll be angrier. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something. Noted, he said. She walked to the door. She walked past Arabella and out into the summer morning and down toward the horses, and she did not look back because if she looked back, she would see him standing in the doorway of that house watching her go, and she already knew he was doing exactly that, and she did not need to see it to know how it would feel. They were halfway to Crane House when Arabella pulled her horse alongside Eliza's and said very quietly and very pleasantly, He's looking for a wife, you know. Eliza said nothing. Hartwell told me. He's been looking for 2 years, very particular about it. A pause. Not the sort of man who settles. I don't know why you're telling me this, Eliza said. Because I want you to understand something. Arabella's voice was still pleasant, still warm. The performance was for herself now because there was no audience. That was the thing about Arabella that had taken Eliza the longest to understand. She performed even when nobody was watching. Men like Ambrose Whitfield do not take in girls like you, Eliza. They take in projects, problems they find interesting for a season. I know that, Eliza said. Do you... Arabella glanced at her. You have your mother's face, you know. Everyone always said she was lovely. A pause precisely timed. And look where that got her. Eliza stared straight ahead at the road. Her jaw ached. She hadn't known she was clenching it. She did not cry. She did not answer. She rode the rest of the 3 miles in silence with Arabella's words sitting in her chest like a coal hot and suffocating, and impossible to touch. Crane House appeared through the tree line, and it looked as it always looked to Eliza when she came home to it, like a place that knew she didn't belong there. She dismounted and took her bundle and walked through the front door and directly upstairs without speaking to anyone, and she sat on the edge of her bed in the small room at the end of the hall, and she looked at her bandaged hands and thought about a man who had replaced her linen and a housekeeper who had known her mother, and a house that had held its quiet around her like something kind. Look where that got her. She looked at her hands for a long time. Then she stood up, washed her face, put on her work dress, went back downstairs. There was a household to run. Arabella needed her gloves repaired by afternoon. The silver allegedly needed polishing. Eliza picked up the rag. She picked up the silver. And she thought very quietly and very carefully about a voice through a door at night and the words it had said, "It costs me nothing, and it might save you something." She thought about what it would mean to be saved by something. She thought about whether she still believed it was possible. She was still thinking about it when the letter arrived. It came just before supper. A sealed note, No return address on the outside, delivered by a boy she didn't recognize, who disappeared before she could question him. Her name on the front, in handwriting she had never seen before. Clean and direct and slightly impatient looking, like the man who had written it. She broke the seal in the pantry alone, where nobody would see her face. It said, "There is a position open at Whitfield Manor. Estate accounts and household correspondence. Mrs. Hawkins tells me you have a head for figures. If you want it, the position is yours. If you don't, burn this. No debt either way." Eliza read it twice. She folded it. She pressed it flat against her palm and stood in the pantry with the smell of dried herbs around her and the sound of Arabella calling her name from 2 rooms away, and she thought about what 4 more years looked like. Then 5. Then 10. She thought about her mother on a gray horse sitting straight. She thought no debt either way. She slid the letter into her pocket. "Coming," she called. Her voice, as always, was perfectly steady. She burned the letter the next morning. Not because she'd decided against it, because she needed 3 days to be certain she was deciding for herself, and not just running toward the first door that opened the way frightened people did. She'd watched her mother do that once. She wasn't going to do it herself. She burned it, and she watched the ash, and she waited. On the first day, Arabella found a flaw in the silver polishing and made Eliza do it again. All of it. Every piece. It took 4 hours. On the second day, Aunt Margarite mentioned over breakfast in the pleasant tone she used for things she meant to land hard that Mr. Hartwell had inquired about Arabella, and that it seemed very promising, and wasn't it lovely when things worked out for people who deserved it. Eliza had said yes, ma'am, and refilled the coffee. On the third day, she walked to Whitfield Manor. She told no one where she was going. She left before the household was properly awake in the gray cool of early morning, and she walked the 3 miles on dry roads with her hands wrapped still because they weren't fully healed, and because every time she looked at them, they reminded her of something she was not ready to forget. And she arrived at the gate just as the sun came over the tree line, and the whole front of the manor went gold. Mrs. Hawkins opened the door before she knocked. "Thought it'd be 3 days," the housekeeper said. Eliza stared at her. "Did he tell you that?" "Didn't have to." Mrs. Hawkins stepped back to let her in. "Coffee's on." Ambrose was in the study. She heard his voice before she reached the door, low and precise, talking to someone about water rights along the eastern fence. And she stood in the hallway for a moment outside and breathed and told herself that she was not nervous, which was a complete and total lie. And then she knocked. "Come in." She went in. He was at the desk. A man seated across from him, 40s, weathered the look of someone who worked land for a living, turned to glance at her, and then back to Ambrose. Ambrose looked up. Something moved in his face fast, and then gone. "Give us a few minutes, Carter," he said. Carter stood, nodded, and walked out. He didn't look at Eliza again, which she appreciated. The door closed. Ambrose set down his pen. He didn't say anything. He just waited, and that patience of his, the kind that was never passive, always watchful, was somehow the most nerve-steadying thing in the room. "I burned the letter," she said. "All right." "Because I didn't want it sitting where someone might find it. Not because I'd decided." She paused. "I want the position." He looked at her for a moment. "You're sure?" "I've been sure since the first night. I needed to be sure it was my decision." He studied her. Then he nodded once. "When can you start?" "I need to give my aunt notice. 2 weeks." He nodded again. "And I want to be clear about something," Eliza said. She kept her hands still at her sides. She'd been practicing this. "I am accepting a position of employment. Not charity. Not protection. If I do the work poorly, you tell me. If I do the work well, you pay me a fair wage. Everything else—" She stopped. "Everything else," he said carefully, "stays exactly where it is." He was quiet for a moment. Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the cousin of one. "You mean that?" "I always mean what I say." I know. He picked up his pen. I've noticed. She left before Carter came back in, and she walked home with the summer air on her face and something unfamiliar sitting in her chest. Not the cracked open ache of the first night, not the cold compression of 4 years under Arabella's roof. Something lighter. Something that felt, if she was honest, dangerously close to hope. She should have known better. She told her aunt at supper. She had chosen supper deliberately, public enough that Aunt Marguerite would keep her voice down, private enough that there were no servants watching. She had thought it through the way she thought through everything now, carefully, the way you tested weight-bearing before you stepped. I've accepted a position at Whitfield Manor, she said. Estate accounts and correspondence. I'll need 2 weeks. The table went very quiet. Arabella set down her fork. Aunt Marguerite's expression didn't change. That was the worst sign. When her aunt's face went still, it wasn't because she'd accepted something. It was because she was deciding how to dismantle it. That, Aunt Marguerite said after a pause measured in heartbeats, is not possible. It is, ma'am. Eliza. Her aunt's voice had that particular quality, the one that sounded like patience and was something else entirely. Think about what you're saying. A young unmarried woman employed in a bachelor's household. What do you think people will conclude? That I'm doing accounts. Don't be naive. I'm not. Eliza met her eyes. I'm being practical. The wage Mr. Whitfield offered is twice what I'd earn anywhere else in the county. I have no dowry, no prospects, and no income. This is a good position. I'm taking it. Arabella spoke then very quietly, which was always more dangerous than when she was loud. He doesn't want an accountant, she said. You understand that, don't you? Eliza looked at her. Good night, Arabella. She stood up. She carried her plate to the kitchen. She went upstairs. She heard Arabella's voice below rising, and her aunt's lower and steadier, and she sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her palms flat to her knees and counted out breaths until the shaking stopped. Then she opened the small trunk at the foot of the bed and began quietly and methodically to pack. She wasn't waiting 2 weeks. She had said 2 weeks because it was the right thing to offer. But she already knew that 2 weeks in this house with Arabella sharpening herself against every surface was more than she could absorb and stay whole. She packed the 3 things that were hers. The small book of her mother's handwriting, the hairpin that had been her grandmother's, the spare dress she'd bought with money she'd earned cleaning the church for the Reverend's wife 2 summers ago. Everything else in this room had come from Crane House, and she could leave it exactly where she found it. She was still packing when the door opened without a knock. Arabella. I told you to knock, Eliza said without looking up. And I didn't. Arabella stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. She looked at the open trunk, and something changed in her face. Not the performance. The real thing underneath it. Something that was almost surprise. You're actually leaving? Yes. Tonight. Tomorrow morning. Arabella was quiet. Eliza kept folding. You know what Mother will tell people, Arabella said. I do. She'll say you went because you... A pause. The word chosen carefully. Pursued him. She'll make sure every household in the county knows it within a week. Eliza folded the spare dress, set it in the trunk. People with eyes and half a brain will draw their own conclusions. Most people don't use either. That was honest, at least. Arabella was honest when she wasn't performing. That had always been the cruelest thing about her. Underneath all the careful cruelty, there was an actual person, and that person was occasionally right about things. Arabella. Eliza straightened and looked at her. Why are you in here? Not to warn me. You don't do anything for my benefit. So what is it? Something moved across Arabella's face that Eliza had never seen there before. It was there and gone in less than a second. But she'd been watching Arabella's face for 4 years, and she caught it. It looked like fear. He's been asking about you, Arabella said. Before the storm, months before. He asked Hartwell about the family at Crane House. He asked specifically about you. Eliza went still. I didn't know that until Hartwell told me yesterday. Arabella's voice was careful now, stripped of its usual instruments. He knew who you were before he found you on that road. The air in the room changed. Eliza thought about a man pulling up a horse in a storm with exactly the right amount of calm. She thought about how he'd known her name before she gave it. She thought about a letter that arrived within 12 hours of her leaving in handwriting that was clean and direct and slightly impatient-looking. Are you saying he arranged it? She asked. I'm saying he knew where you'd be. That's not the same thing. Isn't it? Eliza closed the trunk lid. She sat down on the bed and looked at her hands and thought about this carefully, the way she thought about everything that mattered. Ambrose Whitfield had been asking about her. Months before. That could mean many things. It could mean exactly what Arabella was implying, some calculated approach, some engineered meeting. Or it could mean something simpler. A man who had known her mother. A man who had watched the situation at Crane House from a distance and been troubled by what he saw. The letter sat in ash. She couldn't reread it, but she remembered it word for word. It costs me nothing, and it might save you something. She thought about what kind of man wrote a sentence like that. Calculated men didn't write like that. Calculated men wrote sentences that served them. That sentence had served her. I'm still going, she said. Arabella looked at her for a long moment. I know, she said, and left. She left quietly, which was somehow more unsettling than slamming the door would have been. Eliza sat in the room for a long time after that, and let herself think the thought she'd been keeping at arm's length since the pantry, since the letter, since the coffee in the early morning, since the man at the door who had said, "Your mother deserved better." She thought, what if this is real? And then she thought, and what if it isn't? And then she lay down and stared at the ceiling. Until morning came gray and cool and inevitable, and she got up and took her trunk and walked out of Crane House without waking anyone. And she didn't look back, and she told herself the burning in her eyes was the summer air. Mrs. Hawkins had her room ready. Not a guest room this time. A smaller room 2 floors up, near the study practical clean, with a window that looked east and a desk set under it. Everything she needed. Nothing she didn't. You're early, Mrs. Hawkins said. 2 weeks felt like a long time, Eliza said. The housekeeper looked at her for a moment with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. Then she handed her a ledger. He'll want to go over the Eastern accounts this afternoon, Mrs. Hawkins said. 4 years of water rights disputes with the mill at Hardwick. Make sure you understand it before you walk in there. Yes, ma'am. She sat at the desk. She opened the ledger. She worked. She had been working for 3 hours and had a reasonable map of the water rights situation in her head when she heard voices below, not through the floor, through the open window from the yard. She wasn't listening deliberately, but Ambrose's voice carried, and the other voice she realized after a moment belonged to Mr. Price. She remembered Price, the sharp eyes, the questions about acreage. She kept her eyes on the ledger. She didn't move. The eastern parcels aren't available, Ambrose said, below her by the sound of it. I'm not asking for a decision today, Price said. His voice was lighter, easier than Ambrose's. The voice of a man who believed pleasantness was a tool, and he was very good with tools. Just a conversation. We're having a conversation. The answer is no. Whitfield. A pause. There are parties in Richmond who have a particular interest in that stretch of river. Significant parties. A sale at the right price would be beneficial to you, Ambrose said. I understand. To both of us. The parcels aren't available, Price. A pause, shorter than the others. And whoever you're representing in Richmond should find a different stretch of river. Footsteps. The conversation was done. Eliza sat very still. Richmond. Significant parties. Water rights on a specific stretch of river. She looked down at the ledger in her hands, 4 years of Whitfield's careful records, The disputed Eastern claims, the mill at Hardwick, the legal correspondence that had gone nowhere. She'd read 50 pages this morning. She knew the shape of this dispute. And now she knew something else. Someone outside this county wanted that land. Wanted it enough to send Price here in person. She was still sitting with that knowledge when the study door opened downstairs, and she heard Ambrose's step on the staircase, deliberate. Familiar already, the step of a man who covered ground without wasting motion, and then a knock at her door. "Come in," she said. He looked at the ledger in her hands, then at her face. "You heard," he said. The window was open. He came into the room and closed the door, and stood with his hands in his pockets, and he was thinking she could see it, the way his eyes moved over something. She couldn't see a problem being worked from the inside. "Price has been here before," he said. "I know. The records show a previous approach 18 months ago. Different name then. A Mr. Aldous." Ambrose looked at her sharply. "How did you find that?" "It's in the correspondence file from the second shelf. The handwriting on the Price letters and the Aldous letters is the same." She set the ledger on the desk and turned it toward him. "Same person, different names. Someone has been trying to acquire this parcel for at least 18 months, possibly longer." He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. "You've been here 3 hours," he said. "It's a very organized system." She paused. "Mrs. Hawkins's work, I assume." Something moved in his expression. Something rare that she was starting to recognize. Not quite warmth. Something steadier than warmth. The look of a man who trusted carefully and was recalculating where to set the boundary. "The Richmond parties," Eliza said. "Do you know who they are?" "I have suspicions." He moved to the desk and looked at the page she'd indicated. "Nothing I could prove." "Is it land speculation, or is there something about this specific parcel?" He looked up. "Why?" "Because if it's speculation, the pressure will be financial. They'll try to make staying less profitable than selling. If it's something specific about the land itself," she paused, "then the pressure will be different. And you need to know which one you're preparing for." Ambrose was quiet for a long moment. "The river," he said finally. "There's a ford on the eastern parcel. The only natural crossing for 15 miles in either direction." He watched her take that in. "Whoever owns that crossing controls movement through this part of Virginia. Goods, militia. In a few years, when the roads push further west, it becomes worth considerably more than the land itself." Eliza sat back. "And whoever holds it holds a position, not just a property." "Yes." She thought about Price's easy smile and his Richmond connections and the repeated approaches under different names, and something cold moved through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. "This isn't just a land dispute," she said. "No." His voice was flat. "It hasn't been for some time." She looked at him. He looked back, and she could see him deciding something not about the land or the water rights or the Richmond parties. Something else. Something he'd been deciding for a while. "Miss Holt," he said. "Eliza." He paused. "Eliza." Her name said plainly without ceremony. Just her name in his voice. And somehow that was worse, more destabilizing than anything Arabella had ever said about her mother's face, or where it had gotten her. "The position I offered you is real. The work is real. I need someone who can read these records and understand what's in them and tell me what I'm missing." A pause. "But you should know, if you're in this house, and this dispute is what I think it is, you won't be invisible to the people on the other side of it." She held his gaze. "Are you warning me off?" "No." His voice was direct. "I'm telling you the truth about what you're walking into. You said everything else stays exactly where it is. I'm trying to honor that." Outside the window somewhere below, she heard Carter's voice and the sound of horses and the ordinary workings of a large estate going about its morning. She heard all of it, and she heard none of it, because she was looking at a man who was telling her the truth in a room that was already half hers. The desk, the ledger, the east-facing window. And she was thinking about her mother and gray horses, and sitting straight, and whether the thing you most needed to do was always also the most terrifying. Usually, she had found the answer was yes. "I appreciate the warning," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." He nodded. He turned to leave. Ambrose. His name for the first time. She hadn't planned it. It came out of something older than planning. He stopped. "Arabella told me you'd been asking about me. Before the storm." She kept her voice even. She needed this to be even. "Is that true?" He turned back. He looked at her for a long time, and he didn't answer immediately. He was choosing, she could see it, choosing between the careful answer and the true one. And she thought, please, please, just give me the true one. I am so tired of the careful ones. "Yes," he said. "It's true." She breathed. "Why?" He was quiet for another moment. "I told you I knew your mother," he said. "What I didn't tell you is that I knew what happened to her, how it happened, what Margarite Crane's generosity actually cost." He paused. "When your mother died, and you went to that house, I watched, from a distance. I told myself it wasn't my business. But it kept being my business. Every time I rode past and saw you in the garden or at the market or—" He stopped, set his jaw. "The errand to the Harmon farm. I didn't arrange the storm, Miss Holt. I would not do that. But I had been on that road that afternoon deliberately, and when I saw you in the mud—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Eliza sat very still. The room was quiet. The whole house was quiet. "You should have said," she said, softly. "I know. That changes things. What I said about everything staying where it is." She stopped. Started again. "I need to think about this. Take all the time you need." He meant it. That was the thing about this man. He meant what he said, which was the rarest quality Eliza had ever encountered, and the most dangerous. He walked out. She sat at the desk with the ledger open in front of her, and the east light on her hands, and the morning going on below her like nothing had happened, and she thought, "I knew it. I knew from the first moment on the road. I knew, and I came anyway." She put her hands flat on the ledger. She breathed. Then she picked up her pen, and she went back to work, because the water rights dispute was real, and the Richmond parties were real, and someone named Price was still in the county with an agenda she intended to understand completely before nightfall. She would think about the rest of it later. She would think about it when she could afford to. The trouble was she was already thinking about it, and she already knew what she thought. That was perhaps the most terrifying part of all. She found it on a Thursday. 3 weeks into the position, 12 days after the conversation about her mother, 7 days after Price had ridden out of the county and not yet ridden back, she found it buried in the correspondence file from 4 years prior, sandwiched between 2 routine letters about fence repair and a bill of sale for timber. It was a deed transfer, or rather, the carbon of one. Whoever had filed the original had been thorough enough to keep a copy, but not careful enough to realize the copy had slipped into the wrong file entirely. Eliza sat at the east-facing desk and read it 3 times. Then she sat very still and thought about what she was holding. The deed transferred a narrow strip of land 20 feet wide, running precisely along the northern edge of the Whitfield Eastern parcel, from a surveyor named Josiah Cates to a land company registered in Richmond. The date was 6 years ago. The signatures were witnessed. The seal looked legitimate. The problem was that strip of land ran directly across the ford. If the transfer was legal, it didn't matter who owned the surrounding acreage. 20 feet across, the only natural crossing for 15 miles in either direction, the entire parcel became useless. Access blocked, not by force, by paper. She was up and at the study door before she'd made a conscious decision to move. She knocked. "Come in." Ambrose was at the desk with Carter. Again. She was starting to understand that Carter was his most trusted man on the ground, the one he sent when he needed eyes on something without making it official. She'd revised her initial read of Carter entirely in the past 3 weeks. He was sharper than he looked. "I need 5 minutes," she said. Carter looked at her, then at Ambrose. "Give us a minute, Carter," Ambrose said. Carter walked out without expression. He'd stopped looking surprised at her interruptions after the first week. She appreciated that about him. She put the document on the desk. Ambrose looked at it. He picked it up. He read it, and she watched his face and saw the exact moment he understood what it was. Not alarm, not panic. The kind of controlled stillness that meant his mind was moving very fast behind very steady eyes. "Where did you find this?" he said. "Timber file. 4th shelf, 2nd cabinet. It's been misfiled for years." He read it again. "Josiah Cates," he said. "I don't know that name." "I do." He set the document down. His jaw was set hard. He was the county surveyor, retired 6 years ago, moved to Kentucky. A pause. Or so the story went. "You don't believe it." "I believed it then." He looked up. "I don't know what I believe now." She pointed to the land company name at the bottom of the transfer. Harwick Land and River Company. Richmond registration. She paused. "It's the same company that sent Price." He went very still. "You're certain?" "The original Aldous correspondence 18 months ago. The letterhead is different, but the registration number is identical. I cross-referenced it this morning." She held his gaze. "Someone has owned a 20-foot strip across your ford for 6 years, and they've been waiting. They weren't ready to use it until now. Whatever changed in the last 18 months? The western roads," he said, quiet, fast, like a man who'd just seen the shape of something he'd been walking around blind. "The state legislature approved westward expansion 18 months ago. The ford becomes a toll point, a checkpoint, He stopped. "A stranglehold," Eliza said. The word sat between them, ugly and accurate. "If this transfer is legitimate," she said carefully, "you may not be able to contest it. It's not legitimate. You can't know. Josiah Cates would not have sold that strip." His voice was flat and certain. He was a surveyor for 30 years. He knew exactly what that crossing meant. He would not have sold it for any price, and he certainly would not have sold it to a Richmond land company without anyone in this county knowing about it. He looked at the document again. "This signature was obtained by fraud, or it was forged entirely." "Can you prove that?" "I can find Cates." He was already standing. "If he's alive, I can find him. And if the document holds up before a judge while you're looking." He looked at her. "Price will come back," she said. "He knows what this document means just as well as we do. If he doesn't already know you have a copy, he will when he finds it's missing from whatever official record exists." She kept her voice level. "You need a lawyer before he comes back. Someone you trust. Not someone from this county." "Why not this county?" "Because someone in this county helped file this transfer without raising a single question, and I don't know who it was yet." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yet," he said. "Give me 2 more days in those files." He was quiet. Then, "I'll send for a man in Charlottesville, Thomas Reeves. I've worked with him before." He picked up the document and locked it in the desk drawer. "Don't discuss this with anyone in the house except Mrs. Hawkins." "Of course." "Eliza." She stopped at the door. "Good work," he said. It was plain and direct, not dressed up, the way he did everything. She went back upstairs. She went back to the files. She found the county connection by Friday afternoon. She didn't want it to be who it was. She sat with the papers in her hands for a long time, hoping she'd misread it. Hoping the handwriting was coincidence. Hoping the date and the signature and the notation in the margin were all unrelated facts that had simply arranged themselves to look like something they weren't. They weren't. She'd been in these files long enough to know. The county clerk who had processed the deed transfer 6 years ago, who had logged it and filed it, and asked no questions about a 20-foot strip of riverside land changing hands, was the same man who currently managed the property records for 4 of the largest estates in the area, including Crane House. His name was in the margin of the original Aldous correspondence too. Just a note, a small one. Confirm filing WD. 2 initials. William Drummond. The county clerk who had been in that office for 12 years and was by all accounts a reliable and unremarkable public servant. Eliza set the papers down. She pressed her palms flat on the desk. This was bigger than a land dispute. She had known that in the abstract. She was feeling it now in her bones. She was still sitting with it when she heard the horses. Not Ambrose coming back he'd ridden out an hour ago toward the eastern fence with Carter. These were coming from the road. Coming fast. Too many again. Same number as before, and she knew the shape of this sound now. She went to the window. Arabella. Alone this time. No Aunt Marguerite. No Mr. Hartwell. No Price. Just Arabella, on a bay horse, riding like she had somewhere to be, her dark hair coming loose from its pins. Eliza watched her dismount at the front, and felt something tighten in her stomach that was not quite dread, but was dread's close neighbor. She went downstairs. Mrs. Hawkins had already let her in because there was no civil way to turn away a neighbor's daughter, and Mrs. Hawkins had been doing this job long enough to know what was civil and what wasn't. She was standing in the entrance hall with the neutral expression she kept for inconvenient visitors when Eliza came down. Arabella turned at the sound of her step. She looked different. That was the first thing Eliza registered. The performance was stripped down or stripped away, not the careful warmth, not the sharpened pleasantness. She looked like a woman who had ridden 3 miles in a hurry, for a reason she hadn't fully decided how to explain. "Eliza," she said. "Arabella." Eliza stopped at the bottom of the stairs. "What's happened?" "Hartwell." She said the name like it was something she'd bitten into and found bad. "He's been to see Mother this morning. He brought a man from Richmond." Eliza went cold from the inside out. "Price?" "No. Someone else. Older. Someone with a title and enough money to pretend he doesn't need to talk about it." Arabella's jaw was tight. "They had papers with them. Legal documents. Hartwell was explaining something to Mother about the Whitfield Eastern parcel and the Ford and some company in Richmond, and Mother was listening, and She stopped. Her hands were gripped at her sides. "I heard Drummond's name." The cold spread further. "Drummond," Eliza said. "The county clerk. He's coming to Crane House this afternoon." Arabella looked at her steadily, and Eliza saw in her face something she had never expected to see there, not guilt exactly, and not apology. Something rawer than both. "Whatever they're planning, it's moving today. They didn't know you'd been in these files. Hartwell said he said Whitfield was still in the dark." "He's not," Eliza said. Something moved across Arabella's face. "How much does he know?" "Enough." Eliza kept her voice even. She was thinking faster than she liked, the kind of fast where you made decisions before you'd properly examined them, and hoped you'd examined them well enough. "Why are you telling me this?" Arabella looked at her for a long moment. "Because Hartwell came here to court me," she said. "That's what Mother believed. What I believed." The words came out flat, stripped of everything. "He wasn't courting me. He was making sure he had access to the house, to the county connections, to whatever Drummond needed to run through Crane House without raising questions." She paused. "I was useful to him. He was very pleasant about it." The silence stretched. "I'm sorry," Eliza said, and meant it entirely because she knew exactly what it felt like to be used pleasantly by someone who had decided your worth before you opened your mouth. Arabella flinched. Just slightly. Just enough. "Don't," she said. "All right. Just—" She stopped, set her jaw. "Just warn him, that's all. Drummond and that Richmond man will be at Crane House by 2 o'clock, and whatever they're planning to file or finalize or whatever legal—" She shook her head. "I don't understand all of it. I just know they were in a hurry, and they thought they had more time than they apparently do." Eliza was already moving. "Mrs. Hawkins," she called. The housekeeper appeared from the kitchen as if she'd been waiting, which she probably had. She missed nothing. "I need Carter," Eliza said. "Right now. He needs to ride to the eastern fence and bring Mr. Whitfield back, as fast as possible." Mrs. Hawkins looked at Arabella, looked at Eliza, nodded once and disappeared. Eliza turned back to Arabella. "Go home," she said. "Don't let them know you came here." "And Mother." A pause. "Can she be managed for the rest of today?" Arabella's mouth twisted, not in cruelty, in the rueful recognition of a woman who had been managing her mother for longer than Eliza had been in the house. "Yes, I can manage her." "Then go home. Let them do whatever they came to do at Crane House. Don't argue with it, don't question it, just—" Eliza met her eyes. "Give us time." Arabella held her gaze. And then she did something she had not done in 4 years, not once. Not even once she looked at Eliza the way a person looks at someone they actually see. "I was terrible to you," she said. Eliza didn't answer right away. "Yes," she said finally. "You were." Arabella nodded. It wasn't absolution, and neither of them pretended it was. It was just truth, which was more than they had ever exchanged before. She walked out. Eliza stood in the entrance hall and breathed and thought and told herself there was no time for the enormity of what had just happened, which was true, but her heart wasn't listening to reason at the moment. Ambrose came through the front door 40 minutes later with Carter behind him, and his jaw already set from whatever Carter had managed to communicate on the ride back. "Tell me," he said. She told him, fast and clean and all of it. Drummond Hartwell, the Richmond man, the 2 o'clock meeting at Crane House, Arabella's visit. She didn't editorialize. She laid out the facts the way she laid out figures in the ledger, and she watched him take them in and rearrange them in his head, the same way she had the same rapid cold arithmetic. When she finished, he was quiet for exactly 5 seconds. "Thomas Reeves," he said. "I sent for him yesterday. He'll be here by evening." "That might be too late." "I know." He looked at Carter. "Ride to Judge Halloran. Tell him I need a word. Don't say anything else." Carter was gone before the sentence finished. Ambrose turned to her. "The original document. The deed transfer. Locked in your desk. I have the key. Get it." She was moving. She was back in 90 seconds with the document and the 2 letters with Drummond's initials. She spread them on the hall table, and he looked at them, and she looked at him, and they were standing very close. The way you do when time is short and the details are small, and she was aware of it in a way she couldn't afford to be right now, but couldn't quite stop being. "If Halloran sees this," Ambrose said, "sees the discrepancy in the registration numbers, sees Drummond's notation on the Aldous letters, will it hold? Long enough to delay any filing." She kept her voice steady. "Long enough for Reeves to build an actual case." "You're sure?" "I'm not a lawyer. You're the closest thing I have to one right now. I'm asking what you think." She looked at the documents. She thought about the 4 years of files she'd read in 3 weeks, the pattern of Harwick's approach, the gap between what they had and what they needed. "Yes," she said. "I think it holds." He picked up the documents, looked at her directly, and she thought he was going to say something. The look on his face said there was something behind it, pressing against the careful, deliberate surface he kept on everything. But what he said was, "Come with me. To Halloran. You found this. You understand it better than I do. If he has questions—" "People will talk," she said, not as an objection, just as a fact that needed naming. "Let them." He said it the way he said everything that was already decided, flat and final and without apology. She picked up her shawl. They were out the door in under a minute. Judge Halloran was a lean, dry-voiced man in his 60s who had been on the bench long enough to have strong opinions about time-wasters and a genuine, complicated respect for evidence carefully presented. He looked at Eliza when Ambrose introduced her with the particular look of a man recalibrating his expectations, and he said nothing about it, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. She walked him through the documents. Step by step. Registration numbers, dates, Drummond's initials, the misfiled carbon copy. She answered his questions directly and said, "I don't know," when she didn't know which happened twice. Halloran sat back after 20 minutes and looked at the documents on his desk and was quiet for a long time. "Drummond's been in that office 12 years, he said. "Yes, sir," Ambrose said. "And this notation is his hand. You're confident?" "I have 12 years of his correspondence in those files," Eliza said. "It's his hand." Another pause. "If these Richmond parties try to file an enforcement claim based on this transfer," Halloran said slowly, "I can delay it. I can require full documentation from the original surveyor. I can require Cates to appear in person." He looked at Ambrose. "That buys you time. It doesn't give you a verdict." "I understand," Ambrose said. "You need Cates." "I'm already looking." Halloran looked at the documents one more time. Then he looked at Eliza with those sharp old eyes. "Good eye, young woman," he said. "Thank you, sir." They rode back to the manor in the long summer afternoon, with the light going golden and the fields on either side of the road doing what Virginia fields did in summer, and neither of them spoke for the first mile, which was Eliza had come to understand a perfectly natural state with this man. He thought in silence. She was starting to appreciate that about him. "Hartwell won't come back to the county after today," Ambrose said eventually. "No," she agreed. "Your cousin will know that." "She already knows it." Eliza looked at the road ahead. "She's known it since this morning, I think. She just needed a little while to decide what to do about it." A pause. "She surprised you," Ambrose said. "She did. You're not glad to be wrong about her." "I'm—" She stopped, thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet. I'm glad she came. I'm not glad about why she had to." She looked at him. "She was used by someone who found her convenient. I understand what that feels like." He looked back at her. The road was straight here, and the horses were steady, and there was no reason they couldn't hold each other's gaze for a moment, so they did. "You're not convenient to me," he said. "I want you to know that." "I know. Do you?" "Ambrose." His name came easier now. A week of saying it in her head had done that. "I have read every document in your estate going back 10 years. I know how you think, what you value, how you handle people who disappoint you, and what you do for people who don't." She held his gaze steadily. "You are not a man who does convenient things." Something moved in his face that was not the controlled stillness, and was not the rare almost smile. Something she hadn't seen there before. Something that looked like a man standing on ground he had chosen, and deciding he wasn't going to move off it. "No," he said. "I'm not." They reached the manor as the sun was dropping, and Thomas Reeves's horse was already tied at the post outside, a compact dark horse, with the look of something that had covered a lot of ground and wasn't bothered by it. Eliza registered the horse with relief, and something else she would examine later. Mrs. Hawkins met them at the door. "Mr. Reeves is in the blue parlor," she said. "And there's something else." She looked at Eliza specifically, which was its own kind of warning. "You have a visitor. She arrived 20 minutes ago and she won't leave." Eliza already knew before she asked. "Who?" "Your aunt," Mrs. Hawkins said. "Mrs. Margarite Crane. She says she needs to speak to you privately, and she's prepared to wait all night if she has to." Eliza stood in the entrance hall of Whitfield Manor with the weight of the entire day pressing down on her shoulders, and she thought, of course. Of course this is when Aunt Marguerite arrives. Of course this is when the whole thing becomes what it's been building toward. She looked at Ambrose. He looked back at her, and his eyes said, "I'm here. You don't have to handle it alone." She breathed. "Where is she?" she asked Mrs. Hawkins. The front sitting room. She squared her shoulders. She walked through the door. Margarite Crane had the particular stillness of a woman who had spent decades deciding exactly how much of herself to show at any given moment, and had become so practiced at the calculation that she'd forgotten there was anything underneath it. She was sitting in the front sitting room with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and she looked at Eliza when she came through the door the way she had always looked at her, like a problem that had never been properly solved. "Aunt Marguerite," Eliza said. "Sit down, Eliza." "I'll stand, thank you." A pause. Her aunt's eyes moved over her, the dress that belonged to this house, the bandages finally gone from her hands, the way she stood in the doorway of someone else's home, like she'd been standing in it for years. Something shifted in Marguerite's expression, very small, very controlled. "I see you've made yourself comfortable," she said. "I work here. You live here. Both things are true." Her aunt was quiet for a moment. Then, "Drummond came to the house this afternoon." Eliza waited. "With a man from Richmond, a Mr. Caverly." Marguerite's jaw tightened briefly. "They wanted me to sign something, a letter of affidavit attesting to a property boundary survey conducted 6 years ago." She paused. "I was apparently a witness, according to them." "Were you?" "No." The word was flat and final. "I was not." She looked at Eliza steadily. "I told them so." Drummond became agitated. The Richmond man became very smooth in a way that I found considerably more alarming. Her hands tightened slightly in her lap. "Then Arabella came in and told them both to leave, in language I did not know she had acquired. Despite everything, despite the weight of the day and the sitting room and 4 years of small cruelties, Eliza almost smiled. "Drummond left," Marguerite continued. "The Richmond man did not leave immediately. He said certain things about the legal position of anyone who refused to cooperate with a legitimate property claim. He looked at my house when he said it." She was quiet for a moment. "I understood what he meant." "He was threatening you," Eliza said. "Yes." Marguerite met her eyes. "He was." The room was quiet. "Why are you here?" Eliza asked. Not harshly, genuinely. Her aunt looked at her for a long moment, and Eliza watched the calculation happen, the weighing and measuring that was Margarite Crane's primary mode of existing in the world. And she thought, this is where she gives me the version she's decided on. The useful version, the version that serves Crane House. But Margarite said, "Because Arabella told me what she did this morning, coming here." She paused. "She told me everything. About Hartwell, about Drummond, about what she'd overheard." Another pause, slower. "About what I said to you at breakfast, when I mentioned prospects." She set her jaw. "When I said what I said about people who deserved things." The memory of that breakfast was 4 years old and felt like yesterday. "You don't owe me an apology," Eliza said. "I know I don't." Marguerite said it without hesitation, and it was the most honest thing she'd ever said. "I'm giving you one anyway, because Charlotte would have—" She stopped. Her throat moved. "Your mother was my sister, and I handled her child like a—" She stopped again, set her jaw harder. "I handled you poorly. That is what I'm saying." Eliza stood in the doorway and breathed through the complicated wreckage of feeling that sentence opened up, and she thought about 4 years and a small room and the silver polishing and her mother's face on a gray horse, and she thought about whether forgiveness was something you gave all at once or something you built slowly out of smaller decisions. "I know you did your best," Eliza said finally. "Don't be charitable. It doesn't suit the moment." "All right. You did poorly and it hurt, and I survived it." She held her aunt's gaze. "That's the truth of it." Marguerite absorbed that with the dignity of a woman who had asked for honesty and was not going to flinch from it now that it had arrived. "What happens to Drummond?" she asked. "That's for the law to decide. Judge Halloran has the evidence." Eliza paused. Your affidavit, your account of what happened this afternoon, what Caverly said, would be useful to Thomas Reeves, Ambrose's lawyer. I'll give it. No hesitation. And Hartwell. Marguerite's expression moved through something cold and final. Is no longer welcome at Crane House. That is already decided. The door behind Eliza opened. She felt him before she heard him, that specific quality of his presence, the way the air in a room changed when he walked into it. She turned. Ambrose stood in the doorway. He looked at Margarite, then at Eliza, reading the room in 2 seconds flat the way he always did. Mrs. Crane, he said, thank you for coming. Margarite stood. She looked at Ambrose with the measuring look she gave everyone, and then she looked at Eliza, and something in her face settled into something that wasn't quite approval, but was the honest cousin of it. Take care of her, Margarite said. It was not a request. Yes, ma'am, Ambrose said. Margarite walked past both of them and out the door, and her footsteps crossed the entrance hall and the front door closed, and the house was quiet again in a way that felt different from all the other kinds of quiet it had been today. Eliza turned to look at him. Reeves, she asked. In the study. He's read everything. Ambrose came fully into the room and stood close, not crowding, just present. He says the case is solid. Cates is alive. He's in Lexington, Kentucky. Reeves has a contact there. He paused. Drummond will be removed from office by end of the week. Caverly's company will face a fraud inquiry in Richmond. The deed transfer will be invalidated. She breathed out, a long, slow release. It's over, she said. The legal part. She looked up at him. What does that mean? He was quiet for a moment. That particular quiet of his that meant something was coming. Not evasion, just the care he took with things that mattered. It means there's still something I need to say to you, he said. And I've been waiting for a day that didn't have a crisis in it, and I'm beginning to think that day isn't coming, so I'm going to say it now. Eliza held very still. I told you why I started watching out for you. From a distance. His voice was steady. I told you about your mother and the road, and that I should have acted sooner. He looked at her directly. What I didn't tell you was when it stopped being about your mother. She waited. It stopped being about your mother the first time I saw you at the county market 3 years ago. You were... He paused. You were haggling with the grain merchant. Respectfully, but absolutely without any intention of paying his first price. And you got what you wanted. Something moved in his face. I thought, there she is. That's Charlotte Holt's daughter. And then I thought something else entirely. Eliza's heart was doing something she hadn't told it to do. What did you think? She asked. I thought that whoever had the sense to see her properly was going to be the luckiest man in Virginia. He held her gaze without moving. And then I thought, why isn't that me? The front sitting room of Whitfield Manor was very quiet. Ambrose. Her voice came out lower than she intended. I'm not finished, he said. She waited. The position is real. The work you do is real, and it's worth more than I'm paying you, and I intend to fix that. Everything I offered you when you walked in this door, it stands. It isn't conditional. His jaw was set. But I need you to know that I am not a man who wants a convenient arrangement. I am not a man who is looking for someone useful. He paused. I am a man who has been watching one particular woman for 3 years and failing to find a single thing about her that isn't. He stopped himself, took a breath. Remarkable. Eliza looked at him. She thought about everything she'd understood in these 3 weeks, the files, the ledgers, the careful way he'd built this estate and defended it, the way he spoke to Carter, and the way he'd handled Halloran, and the way he'd said her name through a door at night and asked if she was all right. She thought about a man who had replaced her linen without being asked, and told her the truth about it when she asked directly, and never not once used a single thing he knew about her as a weapon. She had been alone for 4 years. She had been so thoroughly alone that she had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the sound of a clock after it's been ticking in the same room for long enough. She wasn't alone anymore. She hadn't been since the moment she took his hand in the rain. "You are the most careful man I have ever met," she said. "Too careful?" he asked, quiet, genuinely asking. "No." She took a step toward him. "Not careful enough, maybe. You could have said this a week ago." Something released in his face, something she recognized now as the thing underneath the stillness, not coldness, never coldness, just a man who had learned to hold himself very precisely against a world that rewarded it. The thing underneath, when it came out, was warm and direct and completely steady. "I am saying it now," he said. She crossed the remaining distance. She put her hand on his chest, flat palm, right over the point where she could feel his heartbeat, which was not as steady as the rest of him, and that undid her entirely, and she looked up at him and said, "Then say the rest of it." He put his hand over hers. "Eliza Holt," he said, "I would like the extraordinary privilege of asking you to be my wife." She felt the words move through her like the first warm day after a long winter, sudden and total and almost unbearably good. "Yes," she said. She didn't hesitate. She was done hesitating. "Yes, obviously." The almost smile appeared. For once, it became a real one. It changed his entire face, and she thought, "I will keep doing whatever it takes to see that for as long as I live." He raised her hand from his chest and held it, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at everything that mattered with his full attention. Nothing held back, no performance, just a man who had decided and was standing still inside the decision. "I should tell you," she said, "that I intend to keep working." "I know you do." "The Eastern accounts are a disaster before 1812. Someone needs to—" "Eliza." "What?" "I said yes," he said dryly. "You don't have to negotiate." She laughed. It came out of her completely unexpectedly real and full, and the kind of laugh she hadn't produced in 4 years, and it surprised her so much that she pressed her free hand over her mouth, and his face did something she would remember for the rest of her life. Something that looked like a man watching a door open that he hadn't known was closed. He brought her hand to his mouth and kissed it. Just that. Her knuckles where the bruising had finally faded, where the road had taken the skin 2 weeks ago, and this house had put her back together. She let him. She stood in the quiet of the front sitting room of Whitfield Manor, with her hand in his, and she let herself feel it, all of it. Everything she'd been holding at a careful distance for 3 weeks, and before that 4 years, and before that, a whole life of learning to take up less space. She let herself feel the size of this moment, and she did not make it small. Mrs. Hawkins appeared in the doorway. She looked at them. She took in the scene with the sharp efficiency of a woman who had been in this house for 20 years and had been waiting for exactly this development for approximately 18 months. "Well," she said. "Yes," Ambrose said. Mrs. Hawkins nodded once, turned to Eliza. "Will you want tea or something stronger?" "Tea," Eliza said. "Please." "I'll bring 2 cups," Mrs. Hawkins said, and walked away. And Eliza could have sworn she heard from the direction of the kitchen the sound of a woman who never smiled doing exactly that. They sat together until the light was fully gone from the windows, Reeves joining them briefly to go over the final legal details. Carter stopping in to say Halloran had sent word that Drummond had been formally suspended pending investigation, the ordinary machinery of a large house settling into its evening quiet around them. Around 10 o'clock, Ambrose said, "I should tell you I wrote to your mother's solicitor last year. When I first started considering—" He stopped, revised. "There was a small legacy, from your grandmother on your mother's side. Margarite held it in trust and never—" Eliza looked at him. "Never mentioned it," she finished. He held her gaze. "No." She sat with that for a moment. The old familiar burn of it, not the sharp kind, not anymore. The slow kind. The kind that told you something had cost you that you would never fully get back. "How much?" she asked. He told her. She was quiet. Enough, she said finally, to have changed things considerably. If I'd known. Yes. Is it recoverable, legally? Reeves says yes. She nodded. She breathed. She put it in the place where she kept the things she'd carry, but wouldn't let carry her. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life angry about what I didn't have, she said. I'm going to spend it making use of what I do. He looked at her in the lamplight and said nothing, because there was nothing to add to that. They were married 6 weeks later on a Saturday in late September, when the Virginia heat had finally broken and the air had gone crisp and golden the way it did in the valley before autumn came fully down. The reverend from the county church performed the ceremony. Mrs. Hawkins stood in the front row and didn't cry, by which everyone present understood she was crying. Carter stood beside Ambrose and held the ring with the careful solemnity of a man who took seriously every task he was given. Arabella came. She sat in the back and she was quiet all the way through, and afterward she hugged Eliza once, brief and tight and real, and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything left to say that they hadn't already said. Aunt Marguerite came too. She sat beside Arabella, and she kept her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and when Eliza walked past her on the way out, she looked at her niece with eyes that had something new in them. Not softness exactly, because Marguerite Crane did not do softness. Something more durable than softness. Something that looked, if you squinted, like respect. Thomas Reeves filed the final motions in November. The Harwick Land and River Company was dissolved by court order. The fraudulent deed transfer was stricken from the record. Josiah Cates, found alive and considerably irritated in Lexington, Kentucky, provided a sworn testimony that his signature had been forged and that he had never in his life willingly sold so much as a fence post to a Richmond land company. William Drummond was removed from office and charged formally in December. Caverly disappeared back to Richmond and was someone else's problem after that. The Ford remained exactly where it had always been, right where it had always belonged. On a Tuesday morning in December, Eliza sat at the east-facing desk, her desk now truly hers. In the room she'd made entirely her own in the 3 months she'd lived in it, and she opened the estate ledger for the year's final review. Outside the window, the first frost of the season had come down overnight and left everything sharp and white and clean. She heard his step on the stairs. She knew it now, the way she knew her own heartbeat, the particular deliberate rhythm of it, the step of a man who covered ground without wasting motion. He came in without knocking, because this was as much his room now as the study was, and he set a cup of coffee on the desk beside her hand and looked over her shoulder at the ledger. "The Eastern accounts," he said. "Finely balanced," she said. "All the way back to 1809. He put a hand on her shoulder. Just that. The steady weight of it. She covered his hand with hers. Outside the window, the frost-covered fields of Whitfield Manor caught the morning light and held it. And the Ford sat quiet and undisturbed at the eastern edge of the property, where it had always sat. And Eliza Holt, who had hit a road in the mud 2 months ago, with nothing but her mother's face. And 4 years of doing fear, quietly sat at her own desk in her own house, with her husband's hand warm on her shoulder, and knew without question and without qualification that she had come exactly as far as she was always meant to go.